Hi. Actually, I'm not, but I kind of wish I was. That's a joke, son. Hi. I'm the wrong hero. And today we are presenting part 6 of our rather lengthy 10-part series on the history of American humor and comedy. Humor and comedy in the American tradition. Yes. This segment is called Broadcast. However, we do have a little bit of unfinished business from last week to attend to. Namely, notes on rehearsing. Well, I'm going to make these short and sweet, see? Short and sweet. Rat-a-tat-tat, honey. Nature favors the prepared mind is one adage that one should always remember when rehearsing to perform stand-up comedy. Never eat before a speech, said that incredible sage of Whittier, California, none other than our former president, Mr. Richard M. Nixon. Ben Bradley weighs in with a two-word adage, editors choose. And E.M. Forster has perhaps the most profound statement of all when he says, only connect. Well, that wasn't so painful now, was it? Well, let's just discuss the media and spoken word for a little while before we get into broadcast as a whole. We have transformed information into a form of garbage and ourselves into garbage collectors, says the always delightful Neil Postman. Talking point journalism. Everybody's talking about X, so we have to find some way to echo what they're talking about. This leads us to something that's been said about journalism time and time again, namely that it's not really about what's happening, it's about what people are talking about. God, I feel like singing right now. I should burst into a chorus of Harry Nilsson's "Everybody's Talking at Me," but I don't have the copyright for that particular piece of music, and so I'm not permitted to. Christopher Hitchens' critique of Mother Teresa reminds us how easily one may garner publicity by savaging orthodoxy in any of its manifestations. Well, that was certainly the point behind the new wave of comedians which emerged in the 1960s, to wit, Lenny Bruce, Shelley Berman, and gee, I forgot the third one, and I shouldn't because because he had a big cellar, you know. Lenny Bruce, how could I forget this guy? Well, then there was also Bob Newhart too. All of these people made their careers. Oh, Mort Saul attacking the orthodoxies of their day, and in fact, one can garner much publicity by savaging orthodoxy. The implication here that Alan Archibald makes is that it's easy to knock down, but it's not so easy to build something viable. We're talking Motor Booty magazine, number 7, 1994, where the following appears. The spoken word universe doesn't end with Henry Rollins. Feeding off the legitimate innovations of the last poets, jazz, poetry, and hip-hop, the nascent genre has become the missing link, a countercultural Piltdown man between stand-up comedy and off-Broadway theater. We are talking about spoken word, so to speak. Of course, all comedy is spoken word, as is all off-Broadway theater. Although most people with discriminating tastes view poetry readings as the equivalent of vacation slideshows, spoken word performances and poetry slams have drawn conspicuously bountiful crowds and extensive media coverage across the country. Then again, on the positive side, these spectacles, like tractor pools and large sporting events, take undesirable elements off the street so decent citizens can conduct their affairs in peace. Speaking of poetry slams, an unpublished play of mine had perhaps what was the very first poetry slam. In a sense, I can be said to have invented the genre, even though I did nothing with this dangerous knowledge. And Peter Sellers was to have produced this particular play, but he did not. What Michael Moore does is stage hit-and-run attacks on the media protocols of American society, says Pat Dowell. You can see where all this is leading. Journalism is like showbiz with this difference, that not only are the stars sometimes dashed to earth, but the ordinary and unoffending foot soldiers can be plucked out and thrown aside at the whim of a new editor or management. Tell them all this, and then tell them journalism is fun. Now, I've been involved in freelance journalism for going on 10 years, 11 years, and every word of that is, in fact, the truth. We're now going to proceed into our presentation proper. This is part 6 of the Wrong Heroes History of Humor and Comedy in the American Tradition. I keep it's a new title every time. It's actually called Humor and Comedy in the American Tradition. H-A-C-I-T-A-T. So this week we're going to be talking about television and radio humor, film and drama, with some notes on improvisation. Hello. Hi, how you doing? You get to work already? Oh. Oh, that was quick. Oh. So, how are you feeling? Good. I love you too, Angel. All right. Okay. Okay. All right, I'll see you tomorrow night. All right? Love you. Okay. Women, I'll tell you, it's not the startup fees, it's the maintenance fees. What a terrible sexist thing to say. And yet, when women say the same sort of thing about men, where are all the men coming around screaming sexist, sexist? Well, but women are the oppressed minority, so it's okay for them to behave in a hypocritical fashion. Being an oppressed minority automatically gives you license to break every rule of polite society and to bend protocol. I'm beginning to sound like the oppressor here. But I speak from a point of view which is practically, if not literally, unique, for I am the world's most despised minority, for I am the wrong hero. Now, we're talking about what makes some of the old television and film stars so great. It has been said both of Charlie Chaplin and Jackie Gleason that their approach was to show the world universal sorrows leavened by an upbeat personal touch, such as that little phone call you were just privy to. Peter Sellers, a master of the Malvolio syndrome, the comedy of puffed up self-deception. This is, of course, the deceased British comedian Peter Sellers and not the American play producer Peter Sellers, of whom I was speaking not very long ago. The mistake most movies make with comedy is assuming that if you have lots of jokes, everybody has to be incredibly frantic, says Mark Stein. Now, Hugh Kenner talks a little bit about animation, and by that, of course, he means animated film. The stuff of animation is metamorphosis, and its theoretician ought to have been Ovid, who, of course, wrote The Metamorphosis. This is a quote by Hugh Kenner. Lewis Lapham writes about American culture thusly. As measured by its list of best-selling books and long-running Broadway plays, as well as by its successful television comedies, sporting events, and popular songs, the American cultural enterprise in 1995 as in 1895 is as irredeemably conservative as it is relentlessly sentimental. Love will last forever. Our love will never die. You are the only one. My love for you is like 1,000 points of light. The same moral teaching informs 98 of every 100 situation comedies that last more than 3 weeks on primetime television. Virtue triumphs, love conquers all, victory is always close at hand, and children never starve. And we're going to get quite a bit into television and the nature of the box. The problem with television, in my point of view, and I did spend a good deal of my senior year in college studying the effects of television on children as part of a project for a developmental psychology class. The problem with television is it's its own separate world, just like, say, Hollywood or sports or religion. But the problem with television is that it's like religion in its worst form. It denies the existence of any other medium as valid. You know those preachers that say, if you don't believe what I'm saying, you're going to go plumb straight to hell? Well, of course, that's a logical conundrum there. But the same is true of television. If you don't follow our worldviews and memorize the trivia which we spout out to you, then you will be totally disconnected from the rest of the country, which follows the rules we set down for them and memorizes the trivia we spout out for their benefit. Fortunately, there is about 2% of the population who doesn't watch television, and you're able to find them, and chances are you will find them in Cambridge, Massachusetts, Berkeley, California, parts of New York City, perhaps not in parts of LA. But there are always those few, and I don't mean necessarily the people who are too impoverished to afford a television, but kind of funny for me to be blasting TV when, in fact, if you're watching this at all, you are watching it on television. But I like to think of myself as embodying all of the most noblest aspects of the television enterprise. The infinitely didactic, educational aspect of the television experience. Max Sennett said, "You can never throw a pie in the face of mother, but you can always throw it in the face of the mother-in-law." And you know, a lot of comedians, a lot of the great comedians of the 20s and 30s, and I'm thinking specifically of Charlie Chaplin and the Marx Brothers, they depended upon the eternal feminine, but she was in fact a dowager. Chaplin had Edna Purviance, and the Marx Brothers had Marge Dumont. But the idea is basically the same. Once the woman is no longer fecund, she becomes the mother-in-law, and it's okay to throw a pie in her face. The comedy of today's show business is that all the artists want to be tycoons, and all the tycoons want to be artists. And we know what happens when that happens. When artists become greedy, then they begin to focus less on their art and more on the art of the deal. And when tycoons want to be artists, the results are usually pretty disastrous. Just look at just about anything Barbra Streisand has ever been involved with, for example. Television is the great purveyor of the status quo, says Linda D. Libero in something which qualifies her as a master of the obvious, perhaps, but nevertheless, she is quite correct. Television is the great purveyor of the status quo. It is the cheering section for the side that has already won. It is electronic chewing gum. It is a toaster with pictures. It's electronic Appalachia. I like to call it chewing tobacco for the mind. Electronic media, says Marshall McLuhan, invite ways of thinking which are nonlinear, repetitive, discontinuous, intuitive, proceeding by analogy rather instead of sequential argument, which of course is also a pretty good description of Ronald Reagan. But then again, he was a former Hollywood and television star. One mustn't forget that. He was not only a Hollywood star, he was also a long-running series host on the General Electric Theater and its program Wagon Train. Um, and of course, Star Trek was originally conceived as a sort of wagon train to the stars. So just think of two very popular influences on American thought, and it all goes back to wagon train. But let's get into this thing about electronic media. Electronic media invite ways which are nonlinear, sort of like comedy, seemingly nonlinear in its proceeding from one topic to the next. Repetitive, certainly that is true of comedy. Discontinuous, to a certain degree, it is characteristic of comedy that there is a sort of discontinuity or a very tenuous thread between one subject matter and topic and the next. Television is intuitive. That means that it doesn't proceed on the basis of research per se. I guess what that's intended to suggest is that television doesn't so much go on what is known, but in what people believe, which is, of course, two very different things. Television proceeds by analogy rather than by sequential argument. Again, we get back to what Jerry Seinfeld said about teaching anybody to write comedy simply by making them take a logic course and then teaching them how to slightly bend, distort, and twist the lessons learned therein. Once a mild bit of jocosity lodges itself in the mind of the chattering classes, the rest of us are doomed to hear it until the next mild bit of jocosity gets lodged there. What if God were one of us? Just a poor guy on a bus. Anyway, that was by Andrew Ferguson. Famous people, says The Economist, are not regarded as normal. One of the penalties of their fame is that they can be sneered at. Always a great danger. You set them up and you knock them down. They're just like bowling pins. They look mighty prominent there in the alley, but they only exist to be bowled over by a 15-pound ball. Of the famous scene in On the Waterfront, Brando says it is actor-proof, a scene that demonstrated how audiences do much of the acting themselves in a effectively told story. This gets back to our topic from last week, the audience. Half of what you do is, in fact, relating to the audience, and the audience isn't merely some passive canvas for you to splatter your action paintings. Comedy at its best is an interactive process. Your job is to give the audience enough materials to work with so that they can assemble what you're saying. It's sort of like setting up a jigsaw puzzle in which all the pieces have already been pretty much fitted together, and all that remains is that final step. Actors work with what they find in us and work best with what's hidden in us, with that which we ourselves scarcely know. And it is certainly the role of the stand-up comedian to work with what they find in human nature. The mind industry can take on anything, digest it, reproduce it, and pour it out. Whatever our minds can conceive of is grist to its mill. Nothing will leave it unadulterated. It is capable of turning an idea into a slogan, and any work of the imagination into a hit, says Hans Magnus Enzensberger in his essay, The Industrialization of the Mind, in the book Raids and Reconstructions. The mind industry, it sounds like a conspiracy, but basically what it is what one might call the collective unconscious, but not the passive process, but rather the industrialization of that passive process. It is capable of turning any idea into a slogan, any work of the imagination into a hit. My MBA marketing instructor, says Robert F. Wolfe, taught us that sex, fear, hedonism, and irresponsibility sell consumer products. These are just some general thoughts on media in general before we proceed to the first topic of our investigation, which of course is television. We will probably have time for television and film, and we may have to leave drama for another time. Controversial is sometimes used as a synonym for god awful. Gee, controversy, what's that? I used to do jokes about mother-in-laws and cute little kittens and the antics of my baby and pet dog. Perhaps the most, I did see this cat on America's Funniest Home Videos, and they were trying to give it a bath, and what people were saying it was saying was no. But in fact, what it sounded to me like what it was saying was, help! Help! But they thought this was, no! But it was, help! Help! And my friend Dave McMahon knows somebody whose cat says, map! Map! Perhaps the most oft lamented weakness of America's celebrity culture is the tendency to magnify one element of a personality to represent the whole. Well, like Jim Carrey has become a synonym for zany. That's just one example. Jerry Lewis's capers have been known in the past as a symbol or a magnification of the person of idiocy, basically. But the comedian is basically a magnification of the tendency to talk and tell stories. In fact, like the Afrin commercial, in which the man has one big nose until he is given the product which solves his problem, so the comedian is just one big mouth, as in the Morton Downey Jr. logo of yore. It is as if the exaggerated qualities that create celebrities also contain the seeds of their spectacular demise. Both quotes by Lynn Rossellini. Today's commercial questions center around how long a product built to superstardom can maintain a position at the top of the huckster's calculated wave. I could see when I wrote some of these down that I was feeling kind of cynical about the whole process of celebrity. The gold rush entertainment possibilities of a country such as ours, where there are so many people that consistently hooking no more than 1% of the public wallet guarantees millions. I've often pondered this. 2.5 million people can easily make or break any sort of enterprise, even if what you're selling them costs less than $1. Your profits will, in fact, amount to nearly $1 million. Product does not move off shelves with advertising. It does not speak in a language understood by the audience. Well, in other words, if you're selling diamonds, then you can't expect to have many customers, but at least those customers you do have will be getting diamonds. And that adage of product not moving off the shelves with advertising is not speaking a language understood by the audience, that is very applicable to the stand-up comedian. If in fact you do go for the esoteric and you do not speak in a language which is readily understood by the audience, then you will not move off the shelf particularly fast. However, like the diamond merchant, if you are good, you will be selling diamonds, and people who walk away will in fact recognize this. Lacking budgets allows writers the luxury of exploring the ins and outs of characters and relationships in ways that feature films rarely do anymore. Well, that's interesting because heretofore, prior to the ascendancy of motion pictures, having the money to explore the ins and outs of character would not even have been a criterion. Perhaps it's not so much the lack of money that Hollywood has, but the inability. Perhaps the type of people who gravitate towards Hollywood are not necessarily those who are the most skilled at delineating character. How do stars get to be stars? They just stand there and act because they can, says Terry Teachout. A Hollywood insider says that of Hollywood that the self-loathing is rampant. John Calley says the target audience, the world, becomes so blurred, and he's talking about Hollywood product. And initially, Hollywood was gearing um, its productions, even pre-Hollywood. The Nickelodeon was gearing itself towards the cultivated lower middle class who had a nickel to spend and some time to waste on a weekend of a work week which frequently exceeded 60 hours. Um, but as it grew, metastasized, so to speak, in the same way that Los Angeles metastasized, Hollywood began throwing its net more widely and attempting to attract a wider audience. There were still some people who considered movie-going to be sinful, but Hollywood in its glory days, which, as everybody knows, was the 1930s, well, really the universality of Hollywood was best perhaps at its height during the era of the silent film, which didn't really, anybody could enjoy it, even overseas audiences, because of course there was no problems of translation and the actors gesticulated in a broad enough fashion so that you could understand basically what was going on. With the advent of sound, Hollywood became more particular, less universal, and there was a certain degree of fragmentation. It began casting its net not in one wide sweep, but casting several nets and attempting to attract diverse audiences with different strategies. And of course, this approach has finally broken down to such an extent, it finally breaks down into smaller and smaller audiences, as witnessed by the resurgence of cable television films. Narrowcasting, I believe it's called, but remember, if you can get 1% of the audience into your theater, that's 2.6 million people, and let's say that's not such a good gross, but nevertheless, it's a promising start. You can get 2%, that's better. If you can get 20%, well, you got yourself a hit. The primacy of the word in American culture has been replaced by the reign of the visual image. That is basically what we'll be talking about for the next hour or so. All television is children's television, says Richard P. Adler. If vaudeville had died, television was the box they put it in, says the ever-cheerful Larry Gelbart. And here is perhaps the most important quote I will be discussing all day, and that will be, "Art is moral passion," and this is by Rita Mae Brown. "Art is moral passion married to entertainment. Moral passion without entertainment is propaganda, and entertainment without moral passion is television." And now we get to the real core of the Wrong Heroes presentation, entitled Broadcast, and that is television. But first, a short break, and I'll be back momentarily. Well, we're now going to discuss television and how it relates to humor and comedy in the American tradition. Networks are eliminating theme songs at the beginning and adding outtakes at the end, eliminating commercials between shows. What is the purpose of this, do you suppose? Well, television is discontinuous by its very nature, and by eliminating the dead air and allowing you to participate seemingly in the process of the building of the show itself, what television is doing in taking this step is creating a vast continuum, not only of the show within the show, but within the show, the block, the evening block of entertainment. So instead instead of a theme song, you will get show act one commercial, show act two commercial, show act three commercial, into outtakes, show act act one next show, and so forth. Sitcomese, how to write a sitcom. Insult friends and family members to their faces. Reverse yourself completely. If a child, talk like a sociologist. When all else fails, try an obscure or celebrity reference. And that pretty much says it all insofar as the modern day television sitcom is concerned. When all else fails, try an obscure or celebrity reference, or a vaguely smutty double entendre will do just as nicely, thank you. Reportage which just restates the cynical with an air of malice, in the manner of those comedians whose idea of satire is reciting old TV commercials with an air of exasperation. That is, in fact, another tendency which is a sign of the times, that so many stand-up comedians can get so much of their material from old television commercials. The fools, don't they realize they're playing into their game? Television postmodernism, nihilism, capitalist juggernaut commodifying even resistance to capitalism, decorative exhilaration a la schizophrenia, or is it an artistic medium coming into its own? Rick Marin and Chaz Fleming say, it's funny how nobody expects talk from late-night talk shows anymore. That went out with Jack Parr and smoking on television. Now it's all news riffing, monologues, comedy, and wacky real people sidekicks. Of course, they're talking specifically about Letterman, and to a lesser extent about Jay Leno as well. Like the backyard savants, barroom agitators, and soapbox agitators of an earlier era, Rush Limbaugh and company bring intimacy and urgency to an impersonal age. Well, basically what Rush Limbaugh represents is the sick joke of the 50s and 60s, the sick humor of the 60s, and the resurgence of that very same humor in the later 70s and early 80s. The instantaneously cynical, flip, and indifferent response to a tragedy. As I was saying, my friend Meg Herbeck, every time she read the paper, she said to herself, not, oh, this is a terrible tragedy, but how can I work this into my act? For 40 years, network television has been adapting the techniques of popular preaching inherited from our Puritan forebears for new constituencies. Television is, in its essence, a didactic medium. There is even a name for this moral at the end of a show. It's called the "Ya see, Timmy," and it was, of course, cited as an example of the moral at the end of a show like Lassie. You see, Timmy, what's on the outside isn't as important as what's on the inside. We must judge a man not by the color of his skin, but by the content of his character. What's good TV and what's thoughtful analysis are different. That's been conceded by most producers and bookers. They're not looking for the most learned person. They're looking for the person who can sound learned without confusing the matter with too much knowledge. I'm one of the people without too much knowledge. I am perfect, says Margaret Carlson. And of course that is one of those little things that I cited last week concerning knowing the difference between knowing too much and knowing enough is a prerequisite to creative action in organizations. Beware of the dangers of knowing both too little and too much. Know when to shape environments and when to leave them. Rick Marin also says, imitation is the sincerest form of television. Reuben Frank, the CBS honcho, now somewhat penitent, said, "I learned that the product of commercial television is not programs. What advertisers buy, what they pay for, is audience, people to heed their message. The bigger the audience, the more they pay. Thus seen, programs are the machinery, that which makes the product." And of course, some have said that television advertisers don't want the show to be more interesting than the commercials. In fact, much more effort and labor generally goes into one-minute commercial than goes into the entire program. The abrupt shifts in tempo, the mix of pratfalls and wicked satire, the explosive musical interludes provided the fastest hour on television, said Stephen Canfor about Monty Python, a classic example of sketch humor, which some say will be the predominant form along with political humor in the 1990s. And that is perhaps why in America Monty Python was not a commercial show, but rather shown on PBS, because the abrupt shifts in tempo, the mix of pratfalls and wicked satire, the explosive musical interludes, those in fact to a certain degree replicate what the commercial represented to the context of the program as a whole. Abrupt shifts in tempo, the mix of pratfalls and wicked satire, the explosive musical interludes. Of course, a commercial can be broken down into three basic components, and this is true of about 80 to 90% of the commercials I've seen. Product-related crisis. "Oh no, my clothes are dirty." Product introduction. "Hey, there's new Brand X." And crisis resolution. "Hey, Brand X sure did clean my clothes pretty good." The American comic sublime, "I Love Lucy and the Honeymooners," said Robert Hughes, without exactly identifying, at least in the excerpt that I quote here, why that was. And I think I identified that by some incredible intuitive leap last week when I stated that most situation comedies revolve around a fool upsets things and a wise man puts them back in order. Well, in the case of I Love Lucy, a foolish wife causes turmoil and a wise, paternal, manly husband figure puts them in order. Or in the case of the Honeymooners, a fool, the husband, upsets the apple cart and the wise person, in this case the wife, Audrey Meadows, rest her soul, puts them in order. The tribalism of television and its ability to enforce whatever is most passive in collective dreaming. That's basically what television is. It is a hypnagogic or a hypnagogic state that we actively participate in, but since it is passive, it replicates the dreaming, but requires us to keep our eyes open. Tell them what you're going to tell them. Tell them. Tell them what you just told them. That is the entry-level sitcom writer's plan, cited by Stephen Canfor. In other words, it's the old rule of three. You have to say everything 3 times because you can't assume that the audience is giving you its undivided attention. In TV land, you can reach a few million people and still be considered a failure, says Paul Krasner, an iconoclast from way back. Roseanne Barr, or Roseanne Barr Arnold Thomas, if you prefer, or simply Roseanne, says, "Maybe the word is vision. I tell my writers, this is not television, it's a 2-act play, it's theater. Forget the garbage you usually see on TV or the movies, and write about the subjects that you don't usually see in television or movies: race, gender, and class. Class and gender are difficult to deal with, but not as difficult as race." And she has a very valid point. The television is, in fact, the television sitcom, for all of its debased nature, is essentially a 2- or 3-act miniature play, or let's say a 3-scene, 1-act play. When comedy writer Merrill Markoe once asked Sherwood Schwartz why the theme songs for Gilligan's Island and the Brady Bunch lay out their premises so explicitly, he replied, "Because puzzled people can't laugh," says Genia Bellafante, citing Sherwood Schwartz. And that is in fact the case. Not only can not only can't puzzled people laugh, but in fact they will become angry and turn to another program, and all of those lucrative advertising dollars will be forever gone. I remember watching with my Aunt Eileen the David Rabe play Sticks and Bones, which of course had a certain surreal component to it, and she was totally puzzled and outraged by it. I remember another occasion watching Death of a Salesman, a televised version with some friends, and one of them, a younger person, said, "I don't like that. It's depressing." So if you don't give the audience a chance to enjoy the experience, the audience will in fact take their attention elsewhere. Repartee takes the place of actual dialogue on television. People can go on about TV being a visual medium as much as they want, but you can't go that far if the words don't work. Basically, some have called television merely nothing more than a radio with pictures. Where Seinfeld is smart and appealingly free-form, Friends is inane and gimmicky. The characters are constantly abusing that most bogus of sitcom inventions, playing out their intimate personal crises in front of the largest possible group, says Richard Zoglin. To a certain degree, this is also true of the new sitcom Third Rock from the Sun. You can see I've been doing my research here. Although I didn't watch any television from 1971 to 1988, with the exception of Hill Street Blues, and by the time 88 rolled around, I was watching everything, because I was then involved in television. And if you're going to master any art form, or at least do a competent job at apprenticing in it, then you have to know the restrictions and the conventions of the medium. This constitutes my commercial break. And now this word for organic coffee. See, it's organic, so I can drink this much and be unaffected by it. Inherited from radio, soap operas were originally designed to be messily open-ended, like Life as It Happens, in the utilitarian hope that viewers would keep tuning in. In other words, they're addictive. Films and plays, by way of contrast, are designed to compress the defining moments of a character's life into a spare and extraordinary couple of hours. And the same, of course, is true of short fiction versus the novel. To a certain degree, a novel can be open-ended. You can almost define a novel as that which is not perfect, but a short story can, in fact, be perfect. And I will refer you, as my mentor, Monroe Engel, professor of English at Harvard, referred us to the stories of D.H. Lawrence for an example of the perfect compression that a short story at its best can have. Today, most mainstream comedy falls into the realm of toothless situation comedy. It springs from misunderstandings, not irreconcilable differences, from irritating habits, not character flaws, from pique, not outrage. Smuttiness is thought daring when it is merely a cowardly form of scatology. Television has done as much as anything to castrate the form. The Times officially subscribe to good taste, political correctness, and fair play, all of which inhibit comedy's defiant spirit. Sickness is judged no laughing matter, and religion is off limits, except for those grinning evangelists who mock themselves. This is something that David Richards said, and was cited by Molly Ivins. Successful television shows are cast entirely in participial phrases. Raising children, working in an office, striving for prosperity, being married. Successful feature films are all about conclusions. Fall in love, win the battle, get the money, have the baby. I am citing Rob Long here. Andy Meisler has something interesting to say about the nightclub boom, the comedy boom of the 1980s. He thinks that it has imploded. The cable television showcases are sputtering. Killing on your first 5-minute spot on Letterman or Tonight will no longer catapult you to fame and affluence. The flood of new young comics is as strong as ever, but now they must aim their ambitions in other directions, towards prime-time television, where stand-up comics are increasingly seen as the necessary raw material for a successful sitcom. V-Day, Ellen DeGeneres, Jerry Seinfeld, Roseanne. The list goes on and on. Unless you're willing to put yourself on the line every single day you're doing this, you might as well just stay home, says Brett Butler on the topic of acting. But of course, it's also true of stand-up comedy. Unless you're willing to put yourself on the line every single day you're doing this, you might as well just stay home. Boy, this sure makes me inspired. I sure do want to go out and do some comic monologues somewhere. If I had a show to do every night, I would do it. Let's just say that. Generally, a great stand-up comic, along with being funny, has an attitude and a point of view. And if you have that, you already have many of the elements of a successful comedy. That Brad Gray, of the president of Brillstein Gray Entertainment, explaining why so many stand-up comedians are in fact sitcom stars. Because, and I'll repeat this, because it ties in with what I was saying last week about having a philosophy and the material flowing from that. Generally, a great stand-up comic, along with being funny, has an attitude and a point of view. And if you have that, you already have many of the elements of a successful comedy. Andy Meisler, going on again about the stand-up comic syndrome in sitcoms. Rightly or wrongly, it is deemed to be easier right now to get a gifted comic to act than to create a character from scratch for a gifted comic actor. Accordingly, there has recently been a feeding frenzy around stand-up comic talent, raw as well as polished. Agents, managers, and network executives troll the comedy clubs in Los Angeles and New York. Sorry, Boston. A successful appearance on a late-night talk show or a cable stand-up comedy series or in a comedy festival may not ensure success, but it can start telephones jangling. He goes on to state, as nearly everyone acknowledges, raw comic talent is not nearly enough for sitcom success. Equally important is a team of writers and producers able to turn one man or one woman's comic attitude into a polished situation comedy attractive to millions. For that, says Mr. Gray, you've got to get lucky. For many reasons, a difficult time slot, a mistranslation of comic persona, a lack of acting skills, even the most highly touted vehicle can flounder. To turn out a series, a once-in-a-lifetime melding of comedy and scriptwriting talent is almost mandatory. Well, I'm not quite sure I would characterize it as once in a lifetime, but I think much of that is very true. TV, says Mark Stein, has its own uniquely inactive celebrity. People who have no special skill or talent, TV stars who are famous just for being on. And by implication, what I think that means is on TV. Right now, there are a lot of popular shows that aren't aggressively moronic, says Matt Groening. And of course, Matt Groening is the creator of The Simpsons. Aggressively moronic, one of those fashionable oxymorons. Aggression does imply a certain degree of intellect, howsoever tiny and attenuated. To be famous, be on television, says John Simon. The requirements? Photogenic good looks and just the right amount of dumbness. That blinkered, hell-bent, humorless compulsion to make it. John Bowen states, all of the processes by which television drama is made, from the first lovey-dovey lunch to the final sellout by the head of the department. So they start out kissing your ass, and by the time you're done, they're kicking you in the ass, is basically what that amounts to. And that's why the entertainment business is such a tough row to hoe. Anything that was not light entertainment before being translated into televisionese becomes light entertainment by the mere fact of appearing on it. Even highbrow programming is characteristically superficial and liberally livened up with the tricks of commercial entertainment. Television teaches a language, and it is a language that, from the time of radio onward, every American child has learned to speak. A certain sophistication, a sense of irony, and an encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture. What exactly does that mean, an encyclopedic knowledge of pop culture? Well, basically that means knowing about television, about certain movies, about certain pop stars, and certain sports for that matter. It's important for you to know that Ali versus Frazier was a big deal in 1976. Parody is the common currency of both Sesame Street and the commercial cartoons, and such training in postmodern irony is undoubtedly the chief educational product of both kinds of program. And of course, this goes back at least to Bertolt Brecht, and prior to that, to Tristram Shandy. Some would call it that unreadable classic. Tristram Shandy will not, nothing odd will do. Tristram Shandy will not last, said Samuel Johnson. And what I mean, when I talk about Brecht and to a lesser degree Tristram Shandy, what I'm talking about is stepping outside of the frame of the proceedings to comment on the proceedings. The 30-minute show favors a slow build-up to the point where a pile of mistakes hits critical mass and knocks a character over, exposing him or her as a fool. Gleason and Lucille Ball, once again the twin poles of 1950s sitcom comedy. Jackie Gleason and Lucille Ball had the hard armor of the clown, the schemer who won't accept limitations and who dusts off disaster with cartoon resilience. Sarah Kerr says, there's a life cycle to a sitcom. A show starts out like a rough draft and hits a rhythm sometime in the second or third season. Right at this point, one of the stars suddenly dies or gets her own spin-off show. A new sassy colleague, needy neighbor, or stray child to become just like one of the family has to be written in. A new rhythm and a tentative new warmth are established. And then around the fifth or sixth season, the whole ensemble, as if to protest their stagnant lives, begins to act as if they're held in detention. And that is perhaps one reason why many successful sitcoms do not go beyond the third or fourth season, and many fewer go beyond the sixth or seventh season. The only two examples which readily spring to mind, which are exceptions to that rule, of course, are Married with Children and Roseanne. And Roseanne is showing signs of stress and will probably not be renewed after their final season next year. TV has evolved too, becoming cleverer, more self-conscious, more topical, and more demographically specific, and slowly awakening to the limits of the medium. This new manifestation is knowing and jaded, stoically sad. As for the best sitcoms today, they tend to display flippant comedians playing weak-willed, paralyzed neurotics, a la Seinfeld, or else to angrily probe the pathology of the so-called average American family, Roseanne, Married with Children. The new plots are often critiques of the old sitcom plots. The joke is that we've seen it all before. The point, more and more, is the boredom and frustration of television, as if no one can believe anyone else is still sitting there watching. Again, this is Sarah Kerr. Diane Witt, writing in the Providence Journal of February 6, 1996, writes, the most gifted comedians tend to push their work to the edge, challenging emotional expectations, often to the point of alienating the mainstream audience. Audrey Meadows complimented Jackie Gleason's turbulence with her own level-headedness. She maintained the show's even keel. This is what I was getting at last week. The person who causes the disruption in the sitcom is anchored by the straight man or woman figure who provides the solution to the turmoil stirred up by the foolish lead individual. So, in fact, the classic sitcom plot is actually that of the classic commercial as well. Zany star related crisis, the introduction of the wise person who will set matters straight, and crisis resolution, usually with a handy little moral attached onto it. The classic of this, of course, is I made 2 dates for the prom, and I can only go out with one of them. What should I do? Well, I think you should level with the boy and tell him you can't go with him. Okay. Now you see, the moral to be drawn from this is not to make obligations that you can't live up to and never break your promises. Now, Jeff Gordon, writing in The Advocate, states, the comedy of Tracy Ullman is an acquired taste. Sophisticated and character-driven, it's humor that more often than not finishes with a thoughtful twist rather than a contrived bond, an almost documentary approach to comedy. And perhaps this will be the coming wave of televised comedy and sitcoms in the years following the year 2000, although I am not counting on it. But I do know one thing. The sitcom as it exists is in its final Baroque phase and will soon be replaced with something else. Perhaps in our lifetimes, perhaps within a period of less than 10 years. Of course, the sitcoms of the 50s were so naive and unself-conscious about what they were doing that today they are very popular fare on networks such as Nickelodeon. And the sitcoms of the 60s tended to be driven more by gimmicks, but they still had that same air of unself-conscious innocence. It was only by the time the 70s rolled around that relevance and topicality reared its ugly head. And by the time the 80s rolled around, well, I wasn't watching much in the way of sitcoms in the 1980s, so I am not competent to state what was going on with them. But one of the reasons I wasn't watching them was because they were no damn good. And in the 90s, well, you have this sort of irony, this self-referential Hall of Mirrors style of parody, which tries to palm itself off as satire. Now we get into the section about radio. In the final hour, we will probably discuss radio and film. And perhaps at another time we will have a chance to also discuss drama. If we still gathered at town meetings, if our churches were still community centers, we wouldn't need talk radio. People feel increasingly disconnected, and talk radio gives them a sense of connection. Martin Kell pretty much nailing it down. Liberals are genetically engineered to not offend anybody. People who go on the air afraid of offending are not inherently entertaining, says Tom Tradup, commenting basically on why there is no real liberal alternative to Rush Limbaugh. Well, there was Jim Hightower, but he got canceled because he criticized the Disney organization. Don't fuck with the Disney people, I'll tell you that. The news isn't sacred to me. It's entertainment. The show is an entertainment device designed to revel in the agony of others, says Don Imus. Although Rush Limbaugh or Howard Stern could easily say the same. Nice to see that Don Imus is the guy that has the guts to actually state this. The news isn't sacred to me. It's entertainment. The show is an entertainment device designed to revel in the agony of others. And again, getting back to what Meg Herbig said, every time I look at the newspaper, I don't think, oh, what a tragedy. I think, how can I work this into my act? Some days, I don't care if anybody knows what I think, but you got up and do it. You're a pro. I defy you to tell me when I'm having one of those days, says Rush Limbaugh. Imus gets to viciously attack people we must be nice to, and hence the source of his appeal. Walter Winchell was part of an American tradition. The poor and actors had always been subject to gossip, and so had Democratic Party politicians. That's sort of a non sequitur. Walter Winchell was in fact in a sense, the father of what we now regard as talk radio. Of course, basically what he had was a gossip column of the air, but in it were also breaking news items, and of course, in the realm of presidential politics, an individual like Winchell could be very, very useful, as in the whole thing about the Franklin Delano Roosevelt third term in 1940. Will he run or won't he? Walter Winchell was utilized by the president's PR apparatus to create a groundswell of support for a third term for President Roosevelt. V-Day, Bill Clinton's later appearance on Arsenio Hall. Ross Perot's appearance on Larry King to announce his candidacy for president. So the next time you talk show hosts get on your high horse, remember, Walter Winchell was the father of you all. Howard Stern and Rush Limbaugh sitting in for Lenny Bruce and Abbie Hoffman at the drums of a politically incorrect comedy. That's not really doing justice to Lenny Bruce by any means. Radio. How to pace a monologue. Pause for breath between sentences to let ideas sink in. Gee, I sure do wish I had the luxury of the time to do so. Of course, when you think about it, I have all the time in the world. If I had spread this out over 20 weeks instead of merely 10, I suppose I could have spoken in such a way that there would be pauses, not only between sentences, but between participial phrases. Sitting in that solitary radio broadcast booth, said Ronald Reagan, I started talking to the fellows in the barbershop the same way I did during our regular get-togethers. Don't try to talk in a special language of broadcasting or politics. Just use normal, everyday words. And you should know, Ronald Reagan, the great communicator. Limbaugh's defense is pat. We're just entertainers. Don't take us so seriously. We're just talk show hosts. It's not our fault if the public believes everything we say, misinterprets our intent, and doesn't seek alternative sources of news and information. That's Peter Laufer writing in the book Inside Talk Radio, and attacking the basic cowardice of the we're just entertainers defense. Nothing is non-ideological when you come right down to it. Entertainment is ideological, if only in its very lack of ideological content. And by the very fact of putting it out there to be seen by a mass audience, you are making a political statement. Contrast and incongruity are at the root of the humor in man-on-the-street interviews. Arcane or absurd questions, prompt, honest, emotional reactions. There's an anecdote concerning the performance group, The Committee. On the night after President Kennedy had been assassinated, the show went on as usual, but it started rather flat because of the assassination, and everybody was depressed. And they did one of those mock man-on-the-street interviews, and they asked the man some perfectly abstruse question, to which he responded, I have no time to think about that. What kind of people are you? Our president has just been killed. And that got an enormous laugh, and the show went on. Now, how would you like to know one of the secrets of the talk show broadcast? It is called churn. And churn is an opening monologue designed to generate telephone calls from the audience. In that way, talk radio demonstrates that it's not that far a cry from the medium of stand-up comedy, because what in fact is the stand-up comic's 5-minute opening segment but churn, designed to elicit audience interest, if not audience call-ins and responses. We now get to the medium of film, and we have quite a bit to go through here. So maybe I will be judicious in my selection of what I discuss. For example, it might be best if I were to pause for a moment and resume with some of the highlights of the section of film. We now begin the section on film in the 10-part series, Humor and Comedy in the American Tradition. A quick summary, perhaps, of the history of film. Well, it started, of course, with Tom Edison's kinetoscopes and the experiments of the Lumiere brothers in France, and eventually it found its commercial medium in the Nickelodeon. People had to move to Hollywood because Edison had a lock on the kinetoscope process, and they decided that getting as far away from New Jersey as possible was desirable, so they settled on Hollywood. The history of film really began with the first great feature-length film, Birth of a Nation. And for about 15 years, films were silent. The great silent comedians were Charlie Chaplin, Harold Lloyd, Buster Keaton, and to a lesser degree, Fatty Arbuckle, and the works of the Keystone Cops, assorted shorts. Short films were, in fact, fairly popular, and even today you can see the product of that mentality in the works of the Three Stooges, which were all shorts. I don't believe they made any feature films until roughly the 1950s, and that was when the original ensemble had more or less gone out of business. Well, then you have Laurel and Hardy and their considerably poorer cousins, Abbott and Costello, and then, of course, Martin and Lewis, the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby. The comic team was in vogue for a while. In the comic group, like the Ritz Brothers, the Marx Brothers, the Three Stooges, they were popular in the 30s, but the comic team was more a phenomenon of the 40s and early to mid-50s. After 1955, it's hard to say what the defining theme of movie comedy was. There were recurring characters, notably Jerry Lewis and Bob Hope, but their heyday had pretty much died down completely by the end of the 60s. And what we're talking then is a sort of the comic trio or duo, or the comic individual as the sort of brand name for a movie comedy, was slowly replaced by an ensemble which did movies in sequence: the Police Academy films, the National Lampoon films, the Saturday Night Live people who branch off into their own film projects. And that is still pretty much the defining voice of movie comedy. There isn't really, with the exception of Woody Allen, there isn't really any one, and Mel Brooks, there isn't any one strong figure in motion picture comedy who is both artist, director, and writer. It has been said of Quentin Tarantino, and here's an example of an ensemble comedy. When figuring out his stories, Tarantino apparently asks himself quite simply what sorts of things might happen to a parade of personalities writ large. Fiorentino, in The Last Seduction, is after the humor of humorlessness, the nuttiness of self-interest untrammeled by sentiment, and she nails it. This is Richard Schickel reviewing The Last Seduction, which didn't have a theatrical release. I believe it was shown on HBO. But it is available in the video stores, and it is a very interesting film. I particularly like the scene in which the stupid hick, which the slick New York City woman seduces and then abuses, is shaving and staring at himself in the mirror, gap-jawed. A very incongruous scene. It is only lately, says James Card, that movie makers have become self-conscious and started to quote the past works of their art with evident deliberation. one of the great established modes in which all art is continued with a sense of its own multiform past as a generative source. What he's saying is that basically it's only recently that we've seen homages. Of course, people were ripping off Alfred Hitchcock way back in the early 70s, but I think you know what he means. Stuart Clowen's talking about the film Ready to Wear by Robert Altman. Some scenes even have the feel of early 60s studio comedies, something directed by George Roy Hill, say it, which you're supposed to chortle with the light because you know somebody's going to hide in the closet and, get this, somebody else is already in there. John Romney says that self-reflexivity in films is usually held to be permissible either in high art or in comedy. Altman, says Stanley Kaufman, the smart but continually disintegrating misanthrope. Stanley Kaufman again. The old belief that if you knit together a number of familiar stories, the viewer will believe the result is fresh. It didn't work in the 40s, and it doesn't work even in this age that kids itself into thinking it can't be kidded. Walter Goodman on Frank Capra. Works that sometimes combine the philosophies of Karl Marx and Dale Carnegie. Well, this is a recurrent theme that I haven't really discussed much in the last 2 weeks, but most comedy is about incongruity, about opposites merging, attracting, clashing, diverging. And that is certainly a demonstration of that impulse. I had a line that used to go something along the lines of, with my left eye I read Karl Marx, Das Kapital. With my right eye I read How to Win Friends and Influence People. And with my third eye I read the Kama Sutra. Funny, huh? Spike Lee's movies, which white critics often say bounce from vaguely connected scene to scene, reflect the nonlinear African-American sensibility of jazz, says Terence Blanchard. Well, perhaps. Speed. The film. The plot has the sort of excess one associates with farce, the screwball comedy of the 30s, unsuccessfully resuscitated in What's Up, Doc, incidentally. The universal language of film, action and passion, humor and heart, says Richard Corliss, pretty much nailing it down for all times. Too many young filmmakers wrap things up in a fatal burst of melodrama. Well, isn't that the truth? Well, you see it in a movie such as Freebie and the Bean, or any really bad B movie, the last Dirty Harry movie, for example. Two guys going over a cliff screaming. That's movie comedy. Well, Jerry Seinfeld is probably thinking of Everything's Ducky with Buddy Hackett. The failure of Citizen Kane marked, Cale believed, the demise of the supremely smart but supremely accessible Hollywood entertainments of the 30s. Except in odd corners of the business, Preston Sturges, irreverence disappeared from the screen. The movies fell into the hands of self-righteous fellow traveling hacks. Earnestness was prized above wit, and politically correct mediocrity was promoted over talent. Morality was back in the saddle. It remained there for 25 years, says Louis Maynard. Well, I'm not quite sure I'd agree with him there. I mean, you did have the Bob Hope and Bing Crosby films. You had the Martin Lewis films. Of course, they weren't really particularly defiant of authority, but they were, in their very irreverence, very much anti-authoritarian, just not specifically so, just in a general way, which of course was an acceptable way, which is, in fact, perhaps what made them so very popular. The smartest figure out a fresh way to give us the same old lie, and we reward them lavishly. Ain't that the truth? The smartest people figure out a fresh way to give us the same old lie, and we reward them lavishly. Marlon Brando, says Anthony Lane, had a Byronic knack for cutting fantasy down to size. Interesting. Kind of a non sequitur in this context, but interesting. Sarah Kerr writes about the form of the movie, and what she has to say has many parallels with the form of the television sitcom as well. The typical form of the movie is an insipid mechanical three-act structure. It begins with a setup. There are planted references to a childhood hurt to establish the central conflict that the character is supposed to overcome. Then there is the confrontation in which the lead character wrestles with his or her demon. Finally, surprise, resolution. Most of the time, the plot is neither convincing nor relevant to anyone's life. Nowadays, even a convincing scene seems like a miracle. Even a convincing scene seems like a miracle. So you have that three-act structure. Childhood hurt, adult confrontation, and resolution, which is just like the product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis, resolution. And it's funny how the human mind works in these groups of threes. Or it's like the sitcom. The goofy wife or husband messes things up, and the strong, stern husband comes in to fix them after the confusion ensues in the middle. Product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis resolution. Most varieties of humor in movies involve someone's humiliation. The humiliation may reveal a character's humanity, or it may ridicule the social arrangements of the day, but the important thing is that someone somehow stepped on a banana peel. Once again, Miss Sarah Kerr. She goes on to say, violence can mix with comedy to a deeply moral effect. Think of Flannery O'Connor. I took a screenwriting course, says John H. Richardson, and learned that a movie should introduce two buddies, build the relationship to a crisis, separate the buddies so they can learn some lessons on their own, then bring them back together. And once again, it's the old product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis resolution. Hollywood is very hard to crack, very hard, and people adapt to every system by doing the things the system rewards. Writing for an audience, though invigorating, tends to corrupt the artistic soul. And writing for an audience that you feel is beneath you really corrupts your soul. So let me give you a little word of advice. If you think you're too smart to be a stand-up comedian, you probably are. However, if you have that redeeming dumbness, if you're just dumb enough to care about whether or not you're successful at it or not, then you're probably dumb enough to be a stand-up comedian, albeit a smart one. A truly great director such as G.W. Pabst holds the camera on the actor's eyes in every vital scene. He said, the audience must see it in the actor's eyes. Pabst's genius lay in getting to the heart of a person, banishing fear, and releasing the clean impact of personality which jolts an audience to life. The clean, clear impact of personality which jolts an audience to life. This is a quote by Louise Brooks. Anthony Lane says, mild fantasy appears to have quite an unwarranted staying power. This may tell us something not altogether flattering about the nature of movies. Mild fantasy in the realm of, say, Bewitched, or I Dream of Jeannie, or Nanny and the Professor, or, well, you name it, The Brady Bunch, The Ghost and Mrs. Muir, or any of a number of others. Hollywood has all the good ideas, and then it hems them in with the same old phony baloney. The maverick scientist, the broken marriage, the life expectancy of each character determined by casting. This is Mark Steyn writing about an otherwise intriguing film called Outbreak, featuring Dustin Hoffman. Dustin Hoffman doing comedy is no laughing matter. He finds it hard to throw away lines. They come at you with weights attached. He's talking about Outbreak, but he might very well have been talking about Dustin Hoffman's performance in the film Lenny, about the life of Lenny Bruce. The fear that doomsday scenarios exploit is essentially the audience's fear for itself. Every movie, it now seems, is a sequel of every other movie. Writers pick over the carcasses of hit films and try to extract the golden elements for their own projects. says Richard Corliss. And of course, that is recognizably the case. And comedians do the same thing. They pick over the bones of other successful comedians' monologues and try to adapt them for their own purposes, if they can do so without being blatantly derivative. In the new Hollywood, laughs have to be dignified by a moral lesson and an emotional purging. And this could very well be why we haven't really had a great many successful comedy teams or comedy trios over the last 40 years or so. Now, the movies Tommy Boy and that new one with those Saturday Night Live people, David Spade and Chris Farley, may be signaling a resurgence of the comedic team in motion pictures. This remains to be seen, but as usual, it follows the classic structure of sitcom types of humor. Not only do you have the funny guy and the straight man, the idiot and his moral and intellectual anchor, but you have the guy that screws things up and the other guy that comes in to fix them up and make things right again. Once more, it's product-related crisis, Chris Farley, product introduction, David Spade, crisis resolution, the team of Spade and Farley. The Coen Brothers, a rancidly brutal comic affront to good taste and goodwill, says Ella Taylor. But I actually kind of like the films of the Coen Brothers, particularly Raising Arizona. And again, it's the humor of incongruity which drives a film such as that. Or, for that matter, one of their films which was not particularly successful, The Hudsucker Proxy. Beautiful 1950s style design, but the story relied on a cheap gimmick at the very end which kind of ruined the entire film. However, it was entertaining, and it's not a film that I would be averse to seeing again. Romantic comedy needs a certain amount of leeway from the audience. What Stanley Kaufman means by this is that there are going to be some things in a romantic comedy which don't necessarily make logical sense. Anthony Lane goes on to write about romantic comedy and states, implausibility is not a barrier to romantic comedy, but a boost. The whole farrago of misunderstanding and desire should unfold in what philosophers would call a possible world, an alternative, slightly skewed universe that obeys most but not all of the rules which determine our own. The whole sci-fi concept of parallel worlds, apparently taken from philosophical musings, such as that of Pangloss in Voltaire's Candide. This is the best of all possible worlds. And in stating this, of course, the implication is that there are other parallel worlds to that one. The swiping, emotionally radical edge that we are tested by in screwball comedy. But Anthony Lane goes on to state, no genre is more grindingly predictable in its climaxes or more freaky and double-jointed in its progress toward them than romantic comedy. And I just saw a Cary Grant movie called Mr. Blandings Builds His Dream House, which sort of bears that out. I would recommend it. It is a fine comedy. Not perhaps laugh out loud, but genial in the way that these late 40s and early 50s style comedies with Cary Grant and Rock Hudson were. The great comedies of the late 30s and early 40s spoiled us forever. They sharpened our taste for complication, for the high of barely averted disaster, and they made the basic recipe of boy meets girl look stodgy. They turned domestic bliss into a bore and divorce into a lark, something to keep you busy while you girded your strength for the hectic pleasure of remarriage. Well, again, that is our Anthony Lane. Anthony Lane talks a little bit about Billy Crystal in the context of the feature-length film. Crystal is trapped in the quandary that confronts all stand-up comics who go into movies. He gets the best gags and reels them off in style and doesn't always ask himself how they're supposed to fit the weave of the drama. It's as if he couldn't acknowledge that he no longer has a live audience. Gee, that reminds me of someone. Who though? Well, eccentric community formula, formulated by Terence Rafferty. Doughty, benignly roguish neighbors band together to do something pointless and frustrate the powers that be. The humor derives from the disproportion between the characters' passions, which are grand, and the actual value of the project, which is trivial. Romantic comedy, says Brian D. Johnson, while we're on this topic of romantic comedy, having made a pointless digression into the eccentric neighbor genre. For romantic comedy is an oxymoron, if there ever was one. Romantic comedy is one of Hollywood's more difficult stunts. The trick is to get the audience to laugh uproariously at two characters who are thrown together in highly implausible circumstances, and then, in midstream, to get the same audience to take these two people seriously as they surprise themselves, but nobody else, by falling in love. Jeremy Irons talks about the difference between British film comedy and American film comedy. In England, we're word-based. Even in film, we dress the dialogue with the picture. We're serving the dialogue because we're literary-based. And of course, that would explain the difference between Monty Python and Saturday Night Live, where grotesquely exaggerated gesticulations feature prominently on both. But in the one, the pictures drive the words, and in the other, the words drive the picture. Sean French states on the books of Grisham, the dictum. Grisham's books recall the dictum that what the American public wants are tragedies with happy endings. Amy Taubman writes about the recent Batman Forever. Camp humor appeals to children's sense of play, their love of exaggeration, their appreciation of the gap between who they are and who they can pretend to be. Mostly, they love its irreverence about sexual difference, the way it mocks the absolutes of masculinity and femininity, and thereby the authority of the figures that embody those principles, mom and dad, which of course is a very insightful way of looking at the phenomena of camp. In the arcane pecking order of Hollywood, the A-list is the preserve of major movie stars of the moment. The B-list is for the second-tier film actors and for top TV stars. Then there is the C-list and below. In Four Weddings, Hugh Grant's charm seems accidental, the most difficult trick of all. And many film critics have rightly stated that in that movie 9 Months that he recently made, too much adverse but ultimately gratifying publicity, Hugh Grant does not display the same type of accidental charm. And I would have to concur with them on that one. But 9 Months is a good example of a type of comedy, the sort of screwball comedy, the domestic comedy, the boy meets girl, falling in love, falling out of love, falling back in love type of comedy, which is a recurring one virtually throughout the history of Hollywood. Buster Keaton's classic film, one of my very favorites of all time, College, has this as its structure. And yet, once again, it's very simply little more than product-related crisis, product introduction, crisis resolution. Boy meets girl, boy loses girl, boy finds girl, girl finds boy, happily ever after. Mark Steyn says something that I will quote at length because it is in fact such a striking statement of what motion pictures have become. Autistics display the following characteristics. They do exactly what they want, although their behavior seems irrational. They love preset patterns of words and numbers. In their sudden outbursts of anger, They're capable of displaying superhuman strength. They can mimic everything around them with uncanny accuracy, but they rarely speak in their own voice. This surely is the condition of the average Hollywood movie, a gifted, selfish formula, following mimic which lavishes most of its energy and explosions of violence, yet rarely finds an individual voice. Films today mostly tap into our memories of images and situations and devices from other films. The autistic theory of film as opposed to the auteur theory. All built on a theme but nothing to do with talent, says Ken Williams about the British carry-on films. Willis, says Mark Stein, has what all great stars have, the illusion of ease. And it's certainly what all great stand-up comedians have as well, unless they cultivate the illusion of ill-at-easeness, as in the line which stretches from Woody Allen to Stephen Wright. What counts is not the hoops, but the guy being put through them, says Mark Stein, again about Bruce Willis, and referring specifically to Die Hard with a Vengeance. Cocteau said he didn't care about being noticed for his style. He only wanted to be noticed for his ideas, and even better, for the influence of his ideas. And this is a quote. This is Michael Christian quoting the French film director Jean Cocteau. Writing popular fiction, says Robert Cooper, with an eye on Hollywood is the game to be in. Speed of plot is an integral element in Michael Christian's formula. He capitalizes on our limited concentration span. Adults are portrayed as techno-muttonheads. The good guys are rugged and handsome. The boogeymen use foul language and inevitably wind up wedged between dinosaur jaws. Mark Carnes writes, too much is involved in making movies to make fidelity to the original a realistic criterion of judgment. They are parallel, not duplicate realities. There is nothing duller on the screen than being accurate but not dramatic, said the film producer Daryl F. Zanuck. A picture gets made either because movie moguls want to be the guy who's starring in it or they want to be with the woman. Well, I'm beginning to feel a little bit like Rick Stilton here. Stuntmen don't get laughs. This is Buster Keaton explaining why he did his own stunts. Something which today only one film star does, and that, of course, is the immortal Jackie Chan. Film comedy today seems by far the most forced and formulaic of any genre. Most jokes in comedy today are referential. They're about other stars, other films. They're of the moment. This is something that stand-up comedians, I think, should strive to avoid. Perhaps not at all costs. One needn't be obsessive compulsive about deleting all topical references from one's monologue. But one should be careful that one is not, in fact, a hollow man, a mere shell to hang the current crazes upon. Buster Keaton, tapped the true energy of comedy. Not the phony energy where everyone's running around in circles, but the energy that can come from just standing still. Richard Oliva writes about one of the great dangers of Hollywood, the fatuousness of filmmakers entranced by their own slyness. Now let's talk for a moment about the genre of screwball comedy. Robert Mazzucato has quite a bit to say about this genre. He states, screwball comedy began in the middle 30s and ending a decade or so later was a distinctively cinematic phenomenon. Though owing a debt to Broadway, the farces of Ben Heck or MacArthur, the smart set of Barry or Berman, its mating of verbal and visual wit was Hollywood's way of finally liberating itself from the staginess of many an early sound film. The irreverence of the zeitgeist, as with Fields and Mae West, the irreverence of the sacred monster, Weston fields were like Johnsonian humors, creatures of a totally timeless and private universe. Fields eternally, the importunate Scalloway. West eternally, the cartoon femme du monde, woman of the world. And again, this is like this is what we like to define a decade in humor, whatever the genre, by its counterposed opposites, say Lucille Ball and Jackie Gleason 50s sitcom comedy. So we might define the 1930s and early 40s by the duo in one film, My Little Chickadee, of Mae West and W.C. Fields. James Bowman writes, the paradox that the more strange and weird and futuristic one wishes to make a picture, the more tired and hackneyed the devices one has to use. John Simon writes at devastating length about the notion that something is based on a true story. Based on a true story is today's magic film formula. Magic film formula. At worst, that means guaranteeing the audience something more authentic than the typical Hollywood tall tale, while under the cover of based on, spinning a large ball of Hollywood yarn around a small spool of reality. John Simon goes on to write about the film To Die For. To Die For, shrewdly, is a comedy which is highly advisable nowadays. The grisliest brutality is, of course, permissible, provided it is as unserious as a preposterous car chase. Anything weightier than that must be sneaked in a format you can laugh off. Quentin Tarantino has figured this out. He offers his spurious material in a risible package and assumes it will be taken seriously, and, sad to say, it is. John Romney writes about the great Italian director Federico Fellini and states, Fellini's alter ego in 8½, is a rather grand demiurge of an anti-hero, riddled with confusion and embarrassment, but at bottom secure in the knowledge that from his very embarrassment wonderful jeweled monsters would burgeon. And again, this is the thing that we keep getting back to time and time again in this week. Embarrassment as a source, as driving a certain type of comedy. The fool embarrasses himself. The wise man sweeps in to resolve it, and there is a final moral attached to the end. John Romney goes on to write, we look to European cinema for art, to the American independents for more pragmatic angst among the baseball caps and gaffer tape. John Romney, in a review of Tom DeSillo's book Eating Crow, which is about independent filmmaking. Eating Crow is brilliant on several counts, on the rivalry between independent filmmakers who loathe their peers for getting the funding that eludes them, on the vapid business wars that means anyone with half a name will be surrounded by no-hope sycophants and ambulance chasers, and by petty moguls only too happy to bolster their fragile egos even further. Richard Schickel writes about the genre of the Western, and specifically the gunfighter film, which does not preclude a film such as Dirty Harry. Specifically the third Dirty Harry film, The Deadpool. To some degree, all gunfighter films are meditations on celebrity. As the hero proceeds along his increasingly corpse-strewn path, making one vivid assertion after another of his deadly prowess, he becomes a public figure, a source of rumor, legend, and awe, just like a movie star. His reputation always preceding him, simultaneously distancing and entrancing his public, becomes both a source of strength and a source of danger, in that it encourages people who want a piece of his fame to form an entourage around him or challenge him to a deadly encounter. Well, we're getting back to Fellini for a moment. I don't mind, says Fellini, speaking autobiographically, because I reveal less of myself talking about my real life than I do if I talk about the layer underneath, the one of my fantasies, dreams, and imaginations. We will have to mark this passage because it is very vital to the understanding of stand-up comedians and stand-up comedy. I reveal less of myself talking about my real life than I do if I talk about the layer underneath, the one of my fantasies, dreams, and imaginations. Fellini's films, says Andrea Lee, have a dozen layers of illusion, which, as all real works of art, finish in mystery. Fellini's films at their best are as sublimely playful as his drawings, and never lower themselves to carry messages. So much for the didactic impulse of Hollywood today. What else can you possibly say about an industry which places self-confessed icons of white trash vulgarity on the world's celluloid, but to accuse Hollywood of a lack of patriotism? Well, it didn't work for Bob Dole. I'm not sure that Cosima von Bülow is going to get much mileage out of that either. A. Alvarez talks about how first-rate directors usually do best when adapting second-rate books because first-rate books induce reverence and cramp their style. And the example he gives is Robert Altman's MASH, which is a first-rate movie about a second-rate book, and the director Nichols' Catch-22, which is a decidedly second-rate film about a first-rate book. Richard Corliss talks about manipulation and says, manipulative is just the word we use when we have caught artists at the parlor trick of making us cry. Hollywood has forgotten subtlety. The comedies are gross, the thrillers sadistic, the dramas moral tales for preschoolers. Was this said in the 1920s? No. It was said by Richard Corliss in 1995. Quentin Tarantino, says Mark Stein, takes something raw and real and makes it blandly decorative. He's really the Lawrence Welk of testosterone. Now, this is such an inspired phrase that I simply had to stick it in here. John Simon writes about Oliver Stone that excess is like mother's milk to Oliver Stone. Oliver Stone, says James Bowman, knows how to use no cinematic instrument more delicate than a bludgeon. Do you see the course that we're sort of running here? The lack of subtlety inherent in Hollywood product. When filmmakers shy away from the complex and subtle characters of classics, they often inadvertently inject the ugly stereotype they thought needed avoiding in the first place. Vulgarities the original author could never even imagine. This is Michael Glitz talking about the recent Disney film Tom and Huck. There are two kinds of lousy movies, those made by morons and those made in the firm belief that we are the morons. The former are forgivable, the latter are infuriating, says Richard Schickel. Of course, that sounds an awful lot like something that Jay Sherman said in a recent episode, repeated episode of The Critic. Two types of lousy movies, those made by morons and those made in the firm belief that we are the morons. On the strength of his best work from 1940 to 1944, Preston Sturges belongs with the great writer-directors, the true auteurs, Chaplin, Keaton, Bergman. And that may well be. You'll notice that Jerry Lewis was not included in this list, nor was Mel Brooks, nor was Woody Allen. But we have to deal with what our generation offers up to us. At his best, says Richard Schickel, Gene Kelly reminded us that, in reality, we are obliged to improvise our happiness with such materials as fall to hand. Of course, Gene Kelly recently passed away, and so he's been in the news. Gene Kelly, part of a generation that wanted to reinvent both the stage musical and dance musical. It saw no reason why song and dance shouldn't reflect the realities of everyday life, and at the same time, illuminate our every night dream life. On Broadway, it was Rodgers and Hammerstein. In Hollywood, MGM. Together, the complete complexity of his ambitions and the underlying innocence of his spirit constitute the inextricable weave of this dear man's singularity. I believe he means dear in the sense of difficult to find. In underworld caper movies, there is a mandatory minimum motherfucker quotient, says Mark Stein. And as a matter of fact, Die Hard with a Vengeance 2 is one example of just this phenomenon. I saw another movie recently. It was excellent. But unfortunately, I can't seem to remember. Oh yeah, The Usual Suspects. That was certainly an example of that. The crime thrillers dwindled down to unbalanced matches between smart crooks and dumb police, or maverick cop and Looney Tune villain. And we have about 100 examples of this. The film Seven is one of the most recent examples of the smart crook versus the dumb police. And the maverick cop versus the Looney Tune villain is, of course, a staple of the Dirty Harry films. Psychos and gals are the perennial flies in the ointment of the perfect crime, says Mark Stein. On the film Leaving Las Vegas, Matthew Patton states, Nicolas Cage isn't anything but a drunk, and his various travails are vulgar spectacles staged for our amusement. Matthew Patton talks about critics, one critic in particular, and he says something which perhaps cuts a little too close to the bone. Critic David Denby has the same well-educated bad taste that distinguishes most glossy magazine film critics and the more pretentious executives in Hollywood. Well, we're winding down this segment of the Wrong Heroes course on comedy, but not without at least a couple more quotes in the field of film. Jackie Chan, a comic warrior, vulnerable but triumphant, inspired by the silent clowns Buster Keaton and Harold Lloyd. And of course, Jackie Chan has a movie called Rumble in Brooklyn, I think it is, if you want to see him in an American film. Of course, the director John Woo is currently in the cinemas with the film Broken Arrow, which I intend to see just as soon as I can. Haven't been this excited about a new movie since I don't know when. Of course, I'm doomed to be disappointed, but nevertheless. Liesl Schillinger says, ever since The Crying Game, The Piano, and Pulp Fiction grossed tens of millions of dollars, Hollywood seems intent on crushing the luscious new directorial jailbait with its over-eager embrace. What she's talking about is how independent filmmakers are suddenly very hot, very much in vogue in today's Hollywood. That fellow who did Clerks is doing a feature-length film set in a shopping mall. Clerks wasn't a bad film. It was sort of like Slacker or Dazed and Confused or American Graffiti, the sort of teeny angst slice of life thing. Fast Times at Ridgemont High. There's any of a number of examples. Well, we probably won't have much time to finish the section on drama, so we will save it for another time. And I will pause momentarily to scope out exactly what it is I am going to do and be right back. Well, I hope those of you who are watching this have gained something of value from this presentation, particularly anybody out there who might just happen to be a stand-up comedian or aspiring stand-up comedian. In this last 10 minutes or so, I'd like to discuss comedic technique, particularly techniques of memorization and pacing. Murray Kempton talks about the subtleties that even coarse performers require if they are to stick in our memories. And by subtleties, I think what he means perhaps is these little things which don't amount to much at their root, but which mean so much in creating a picture as a whole. Not just the way you use your comic frame, but the way in which you use your body to embody that comic frame. I, for example, have the mask, among other things. I don't depend much on eye movement as a result. If I can make the material fly on the basis of its verbal wit, then I have done my job. And at such time as I decide that the mask is no longer appropriate, then I can start mugging and leering and rolling my eyes and making funny faces. Matthew Paris writes about mimicry. Mimicry, I believe, is at root, and rather seriously, an expression of hatred. It is a primal expression, one of the first ways that children and baboons learn to hurt each other without physical violence. Can you mimic with a twinkle in your eye? Try, and you will find it goes wrong. Well, I'm sure there's a great many impressionists out there who would not look too kindly upon seeing their artistry degraded to mere mimicry. Jerry Seinfeld, in the issue of Esquire dated September 1994, states, "If I wanted to train someone as a comedian, I would make them do lots of proofs." That's what comedy is, a kind of bogus proof. You set up a fallacious premise and then prove it with rigorous logic. It just makes people laugh. You must think very rationally on a completely absurd plane. Well, some examples of the fallacious premise. The moon follows me around, or at least so I used to think. Now I realize it's following my father around because he owes it money. Just because a critic can detect patterns doesn't mean that a direct causal influence exists. And just because a comedian can detect patterns does not mean that a direct causal influence exists either. But in comedy, one is given a certain type of leeway, which one is not given in criticism. And I have done both, so I know. To enlighten as he could and be invitingly readable was Graham Greene's credo, and I think it should be that of the stand-up comedian as well. To enlighten as you can and be invitingly listenable. Now, a comedian can't really deal entirely in vague generalities. That is, of course, a form of intellectual sloppiness which a comedian will, in fact, indulge in for comic effect. But to a certain degree, a comedian also has to have the ability to be a line-item thinker. Bert Williams, the famous comedian of the early part of the century, stated, "Eavesdropping on human nature is one of the most important parts of a comedian's work. Observing people and the funny things they do. Not kids say the darndest things, the avuncular Art Linkletter style of démodé humor popular in the 60s, but eavesdropping on human nature. Style is an attitude that individuals within a culture express through their choice of cultural forms and the way they choose to express themselves within a form. When you have your own style, and I'm sure that people have told you this time and time again if you are an aspiring comedian, once you have your own style, you have it made. Any writer will hear this. Once you find your own voice. But nobody ever tells you what style specifically is. An attitude. An attitude that individuals within a culture express through their choice of cultural forms and the way they choose to express themselves within a form. When you hear a great speech, you know it's something someone has delivered many times, says James Humes. If you take your 5-minute monologue that you have never performed before and you perform it in front of a mirror 5 times, in front of an individual another 5 times, and in front of a video camera another 5 times, I guarantee you that if that comic monologue is at all funny, you will in fact get laughs from it. If you don't maintain control, someone else is going to take it. That is, of course, a cardinal rule of stand-up comedy. You have to be in control, or at the very least, the bare minimum, give the impression of maintaining that control. Before I perform, says Roseanne, I cast a circle, a magic circle around myself. Its mojo is palpable. She gives no eye contact, makes no gestures of acknowledgement, moves to her own beat. I've observed this many times in stand-up comedy, that the comedian doesn't really want to be bothered just before or just after the set. The best ones, they cast a magic circle around themselves. They want to be left doing their actors stretching exercises. The longer it takes to get to the punchline, the funnier the joke has to be, says Rob Long, repeating one of the oldest adages of comedy. Play with expression. Do everything with the proper type of attitude. Give yourself over to what you're doing. Don't be a cynic and think you're too hip to be part of something. Participate and try to do your best. Wynton Marsalis, advice to young musicians, but equally apropos to young comedians as well. He conquers who labors, says Kathleen Tuttle. You'll be relieved to know that very soon this avuncular portion of this particular presentation will conclude, and with it, the show itself. Truman Capote wrote. That's all that matters. The care he took with language was extraordinary, said Phyllis Cerf Wagner. The visual hyperbole and the runaway kineticism that give short cartoons their swift comic force tend to lose effectiveness over the long haul of a feature film. And that, of course, is the same for comedians. A cartoon and a stand-up monologue both have as their basic unit of time 7 minutes. Once you expand your comedic monologue to, say, a three-reel cartoon, such as the Fleischer Brothers produced in the late 30s, Popeye versus Sinbad and Sailor, for example, you're in a different realm altogether, a somewhat mutant realm, to be sure. It's almost as though you're stacking 3 7-minute monologues, one on top of the other. Past that 20-minute mark, it is crucial to know how your audience is feeling. But when you get into the feature length, which could be anywhere from 45 minutes to an hour and a half, then you're really treading on very thin ice insofar as maintaining your audience's attention span, which is why, of course, I always do these 2-hour shows for cable access. I'm hoping that people are videotaping them and taking them in little bites. But then again, videotapes are pretty cheap, but 10 of them add up, 15 bucks. But where else could you get a course in comedy for a mere $15? The discipline learned in vaudeville, the importance of routine, the importance of impeccable preparation was the key to performance success. One of my personal heroes of the 1970s, Robert Klein, on vaudeville. The discipline, the importance of routine, the routine of impeccable preparation was the key to performance success, and is still the key to performance success insofar as the stand-up comedian is concerned. You'll notice that I am following the old adage of leaving long, or at least noticeable pauses in between words. Well, this just about wraps it up, and I must say I am rhapsodic about that prospect. However, before I go, a few more words of technique, basically about the phenomenon known as improvisation. Ignorance is the mother of improvisation, says Norma Meacock. Everybody has always laughed and always will at dumb and childish behavior. It makes us feel better when we remember all the times we've acted dumb and childish, says Richard Schickel. George F. Will states, it is said talent is a species of vigor, and certainly improvisational talent carries with it a great deal of vigor. No improvisation can be any better than the culture from which it springs, says John Bemrose. A key factor for performers, you've just got to do it rather than try to remember what you've done and imitate that, says the avuncular Rush Limbaugh. A professional actor has a kind of tension. The amateur is thrown by it, but the professional needs it. A pageant. The best form of farce teeters on the cusp of tragedy, and it takes a master of timing to keep from overbalancing. This, of course, will conclude our little monologue about the broadcast media. Next week I hope to talk a little bit more about drama, which I didn't get to this week, invective, insult, and practical jokes, sizing up an audience, the heckler, and oratory. This concludes today's presentation of humor and comedy in the American tradition. I am the Wrong Hero, and we'll be seeing you next week at the same time, Tuesday night, 9 p.m., Channel 55, on Cambridge Community Access Television. I thank you for your patience and